The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Officer James Thompson walked down the gray corridor of Central County Jail's B block. It was another ordinary Tuesday evening in March, or so he thought. The sound of his polished black boots echoed against the concrete floor, mixing with the usual background noise of jail life. At 32 years old, Thompson had spent 7 years working in law enforcement. He wasn't the type to make waves or question the system. His father had been a cop, his uncle too. It was a family tradition he carried with pride. But what happened that evening would shake everything he believed in. As he approached cell 237, he heard raised voices. Officers Mike Sullivan and Brett Carson, both veterans with 15 years on the force, were confronting an inmate. Thompson recognized the prisoner as Marcus Wilson, a 40-year-old black man who had been brought in 3 weeks ago. Unlike many inmates who caused trouble, Wilson was known for being quiet and well-mannered, spending most of his time reading or writing in his cell. "Just sign the statement saying you fell in the shower," Sullivan was saying, his voice carrying that edge Thompson had learned to recognize. The tone that meant trouble was brewing. "Stop making accusations you can't prove." Wilson stood calmly, his hands relaxed at his sides. He was tall, probably 6'2", with grained temples and intelligent eyes that seemed to look right through people. "Officer Sullivan," he replied in a measured voice, "we both know that's not what happened. I have evidence of what's really going on in this facility, and trying to silence me won't change that fact." Carson stepped closer to the cell bars, his face reddening. "Evidence? You're just another prisoner trying to cause trouble. Nobody's going to believe your lies over the word of sworn officers." Thompson watched from the end of the corridor, his stomach tightening. He'd seen similar scenes play out before, but something felt different this time. Maybe it was the way Wilson carried himself, or maybe it was the growing unease Thompson had been feeling lately about certain incidents he'd witnessed. "Officer Carson," Wilson continued, "I spent 12 years as a civil rights paralegal. I understand the law, and I know my rights. The evidence I have isn't just about yesterday's incident. It's about a pattern of behavior that goes back months." Sullivan exchanged a quick glance with Carson, and Thompson saw a flicker of worry cross their faces. Wilson wasn't acting like a typical inmate making empty threats. He spoke with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was talking about. "Listen here," Sullivan growled, reaching for his pepper spray. "You're going to learn to keep your mouth shut one way or another." That's when Thompson found his feet moving forward, almost without conscious thought. "Everything okay here?" he asked, forcing his voice to sound casual even as his heart raced. Sullivan turned, startled. "Thompson, what are you doing in B block? Aren't you supposed to be in processing?" "Supervisor asked me to do an extra walkthrough," Thompson lied smoothly. "Something about a tip about contraband." Carson's hand moved away from his belt, where it had been resting on his baton. "We're just having a chat with Wilson here about following proper procedures. Nothing that concerns you." Wilson's eyes met Thompson's, and in that moment, something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, or a challenge. Thompson saw intelligence in those eyes, and something else, truth. "I'll take over here," Thompson heard himself saying. "You guys are probably needed in the mess hall for dinner duty anyway." Sullivan hesitated, clearly unhappy about the interruption. But Thompson's presence had broken the tension, and both officers finally stepped back. "We'll continue this discussion later," Carson said to Wilson, his tone carrying a clear threat. As they walked away, Thompson lingered, pretending to check the cell door's lock. Wilson waited until the other officer's footsteps faded before speaking softly. "Thank you, Officer Thompson. But you should know, this won't end here. What's happening in this facility needs to stop, and I have the proof to make that happen." Thompson felt a chill run down his spine. He knew he should report this conversation, should warn his fellow officers. That's what he'd always done before. But as he looked at Wilson's steady gaze, he realized he was standing at a crossroads. The choice he made next would either make him complicit in something he increasingly suspected was wrong, or force him to question everything he thought he knew about the job he'd chosen. Without responding, Thompson continued his patrol, but his mind was racing. For the first time in his career, he began to wonder if the thin blue line he'd sworn to protect might be casting a shadow over justice itself. 3 days after the incident with Wilson, Thompson worked the night shift. The jail was different at night. Quieter, but somehow more intense. The darkness seemed to hold secrets that daylight kept hidden, and tonight Thompson was about to discover one of them. At 2:15 a.m., Thompson was doing his regular rounds when he noticed something unusual. The security camera in the hallway leading to B block was turned slightly away from its usual position. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but Thompson had walked these halls long enough to spot even small changes. He remembered Wilson's words about evidence, and something clicked in his mind. The camera's blind spot now covered a small storage closet, one that was supposed to be locked, but sometimes officers used it to store cleaning supplies. Looking around to make sure no other officers were nearby, Thompson took out his keys. His hands were sweating as he unlocked the closet door. The small space smelled of bleach and old mops, but something caught his eye behind a stack of paper towels. There, carefully hidden inside an empty cleaning solution box, was a thick manila envelope. Thompson's heart began to race. He shouldn't look. This could cost him his job, maybe even worse. But he thought about Wilson's calm confidence, about Sullivan and Carson's unusual nervousness. With shaking hands, he opened the envelope. Inside were dozens of pages of neatly written notes, dates, times, and names. There were also small scraps of paper with official letterheads, copies of internal memos that inmates shouldn't have access to. But what made Thompson's blood run cold were the photographs. Small, slightly blurry pictures taken what looked like from a smuggled phone showed officers striking inmates who were already restrained. Other photos showed bruises and injuries that didn't match any official incident reports. Each photo had a date and time written on the back in careful handwriting. Thompson recognized some of the officers in the photos. Sullivan and Carson appeared multiple times. But there were others too, including some high-ranking officers he'd always respected. One photo showed Deputy Warden Phillips accepting an envelope from a visitor in a way that clearly suggested something illegal. As he flipped through the pages, Thompson found detailed notes about racial patterns in disciplinary actions. Wilson had documented how Black and Hispanic inmates received harsher punishments for the same infractions compared to white inmates. The evidence was methodical, organized like a legal brief. A noise in the hallway made Thompson freeze. He quickly put everything back exactly as he found it, making sure the box looked undisturbed. Just as he closed the closet door, Officer Martinez rounded the corner. "Thompson, what are you doing here?" Martinez asked, eyeing him suspiciously. "Just checking supplies," Thompson replied, holding up a roll of paper towels he grabbed as cover. "Break room's out again." Martinez seemed to accept this and continued his rounds. Thompson waited until he was gone before letting out a shaky breath. His mind was spinning with what he'd seen. Later that night, during his meal break, Thompson sat alone in the staff room, pushing his sandwich around without eating it. The weight of what he'd discovered felt like a stone in his stomach. The evidence wasn't just about a few isolated incidents. It showed a whole system of abuse and corruption. He thought about his family's legacy in law enforcement. His father had always told him that being a good cop meant protecting people, all people. "The badge means you serve justice, not yourself," his dad used to say. Looking at that badge now on his chest, Thompson wondered how many officers had forgotten that lesson. Around 4 a.m., Thompson did another walk through B block. As he passed Wilson's cell, he saw the man was awake, sitting on his bunk reading a worn paperback. Their eyes met briefly, and Wilson gave a slight nod, as if he knew. Thompson nodded back, barely perceptibly. In that small gesture, both men understood something had changed. Thompson couldn't unknow what he'd seen, couldn't pretend everything was normal anymore. The evidence hidden in that closet was like a ticking bomb, and now he had to decide what to do about it. As his shift ended and dawn began to break, Thompson drove home in silence, his mind racing. The comfortable certainties of his life as a corrections officer had crumbled, replaced by an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes protecting the law meant standing up against those who wore the same uniform as you. The next afternoon, Thompson arranged to be the officer supervising Wilson's daily exercise period. The outdoor yard was mostly empty at 2 p.m., with only a few other inmates doing their daily workout routines in the hot sun. It was the perfect opportunity for them to talk without drawing attention. Wilson was doing methodical laps around the yard when Thompson approached him. The older man didn't seem surprised to see him. In fact, a knowing smile crossed his face as Thompson fell into step beside him. "I found it," Thompson said quietly, keeping his eyes forward as they walked. "The envelope in the supply closet." Wilson maintained his steady pace, his voice equally low. I wondered who would notice the camera's blind spot first. You're more observant than your colleagues, Officer Thompson. They rounded the corner of the yard, passing under the watchful eyes of the guard tower. Thompson waited until they were past before speaking again. You are a civil rights paralegal? How did you end up here? A shadow passed over Wilson's face. 15 years working civil rights cases in Atlanta, specialized in police misconduct cases. Then one night, I was driving home from the office and got pulled over. The officers claimed they found drugs in my car. He shook his head slowly. Pretty convenient timing, considering I was about to file a major lawsuit against their department. Thompson felt his stomach twist. The drugs were planted? Of course they were. But it was my word against 3 officers. You can guess how that went in court. Wilson's voice held no bitterness, just a matter-of-fact tone that somehow made it worse. But they made a mistake sending me here. They thought they were burying me. Instead, they put me exactly where I needed to be. They completed another lap in silence, both men lost in thought. The sun beat down on the concrete yard, making the air shimmer with heat. That evidence you collected, Thompson finally said. How did you manage it? Wilson smiled slightly. People underestimate inmates. They think we're all stupid, uneducated. They don't realize that some of us know the law better than they do. I used my time here to document everything. Other inmates helped. They knew they could trust me with their stories because of my legal background. The photos? A kitchen worker with a smuggled phone. He's been released now, safe from retaliation. The internal documents came from a sympathetic clerk in administration, someone who couldn't stay quiet anymore about what they were seeing. Thompson wiped sweat from his forehead, both from the heat and the weight of what he was hearing. Why are you telling me all this? How do you know I won't report you? Wilson stopped walking and turned to face Thompson directly. His eyes were intense, studying Thompson's face. Because you're different. I've watched you, Officer Thompson. You treat inmates like human beings. When you see something wrong, it bothers you. I can see it in your face. You haven't learned to shut off your conscience like some of the others. The words hit Thompson hard because they were true. He had seen things over the years that didn't sit right with him, but he'd always looked the other way, telling himself it wasn't his place to judge. What you're doing is dangerous, Thompson warned. If they find out, they already know I have evidence, Wilson replied calmly. They just don't know how much, or where it is. That's why they haven't moved against me yet, but they will, soon. That's why I need someone on the inside I can trust. Their conversation was interrupted by the buzzer signaling the end of yard time. As other inmates began filing back inside, Wilson gave Thompson one last meaningful look. Think about what kind of officer you want to be, Thompson. What kind of man you want to be, because sooner or later, we all have to make that choice. As Thompson watched Wilson walk back into the building, he felt the weight of that choice pressing down on him. The comfortable world of clear divisions between right and wrong, between officers and inmates, was crumbling. In its place was a more complicated truth, that justice didn't always wear a badge, and doing the right thing sometimes meant standing against your own. The next week was the hardest of Thompson's career. During every shift, he found himself watching his fellow officers with new eyes, noticing things he'd previously ignored. The way Sullivan deliberately skipped meals for certain inmates. How Carson accidentally lost paperwork for medical requests from minority prisoners. Small acts of cruelty that added up to something much darker. One evening, Thompson sat in his car after his shift, unable to drive home. His notebook lay open on the passenger seat, filled with his own observations now. He'd started documenting things just like Wilson had, times, dates, incidents that didn't make it into official reports. The weight of betraying his fellow officers pressed heavily on his chest. His phone buzzed. It was a text from his father. Coming by for Sunday dinner this week, son. Your mother's making your favorite pot roast. Thompson stared at the message, thinking about how his father would react if he knew what was happening. Richard Thompson had served 30 years on the force, retiring as a respected sergeant. He'd always taught his son that the brotherhood of law enforcement was sacred, but he'd also taught him about honor, about protecting the weak. Lost in thought, Thompson almost missed seeing Carson and Sullivan entering the jail's parking lot. It was strange. Neither of them was scheduled for the night shift. He sank lower in his seat, watching as they met with Deputy Warden Phillips near the back entrance. Something about their body language set off alarm bells. Thompson grabbed his phone and started recording through his car window. The three men talked intensely for several minutes, Phillips gesturing angrily. Thompson couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could read the tension in their poses. Then Phillips handed something to Sullivan, a small envelope that disappeared quickly into his jacket pocket. Money? Orders. Thompson's hands shook as he saved the video. The next morning, Thompson arrived early for his shift. The night shift officers were just leaving, and the tired faces told stories of their own. Officer Rodriguez, a rookie who usually had a friendly word for everyone, hurried past with red-rimmed eyes. "Hey, Rodriguez," Thompson called out. "Everything okay?" Rodriguez hesitated, then pulled Thompson aside into the empty break room. "There was an incident last night," he said quietly. "Wilson, the guy in 237, they took him to solitary. Said he attacked an officer, but he trailed off, looking uncertain." Thompson's heart rate spiked. "But what?" "I was there, man. Wilson didn't attack anyone. Sullivan and Carson just showed up and said they had orders to move him. When Wilson asked to see the transfer paperwork, Rodriguez swallowed hard. They said he resisted. But he didn't. He didn't fight back at all, just kept saying he wanted to see the proper documentation." Thompson fought to keep his voice steady. "Did you put this in your report?" Rodriguez looked down. "Sullivan wrote the report. Said he'd help me remember what happened. I signed it. I got a baby on the way, Thompson. I can't lose this job." As Rodriguez left, Thompson leaned against the wall, feeling sick. They were making their move against Wilson, just as he predicted. The evidence must be making them nervous enough to risk such an obvious play. During his shift, Thompson managed to get a look at the solitary confinement log. Wilson was in cell S15, listed for assaulting an officer and resisting transfer. The duration was marked as indefinite pending investigation. Thompson knew what that meant. They'd keep Wilson in solitary until they could figure out where the evidence was hidden, or until they could arrange an accident. Isolation did strange things to people. It wouldn't be the first time an inmate hurt himself in solitary. As his shift ended, Thompson sat in his car again, this time with purpose. He pulled out his phone and looked at two numbers he'd saved. One was for internal affairs. The other was for a newspaper reporter who'd done stories on prison conditions before. His father's words echoed in his head. A badge means protecting people. Thompson took a deep breath and started dialing. Sometimes protecting people meant making the hardest choice of all. The Internal Affairs office was located in a plain brick building downtown, far from the jail. Thompson sat in the waiting room at 7 a.m., still in his uniform from the night shift. His hands clutched a thick folder containing everything he'd gathered, his notes, the video from the parking lot, and most importantly, photos he'd taken of Wilson's evidence before returning it to its hiding place. Agent Sarah Martinez had the kind of face that gave nothing away. She sat across from Thompson in a small interview room, reviewing his materials with careful attention. The only sound was the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the rustle of papers. "You understand what you're doing here, Officer Thompson?" she finally asked, looking up at him. "Once we start this investigation, there's no going back. Your fellow officers will know someone talked." Thompson nodded, his throat dry. "I understand. But there's an inmate in solitary right now who might not have much time. Marcus Wilson. We're trying to silence him." Martinez made a note. "Tell me about Wilson." For the next 2 hours, Thompson laid out everything. The initial confrontation he'd witnessed, discovering the evidence, his conversations with Wilson, and finally, the suspicious transfer to solitary. As he spoke, 2 more agents joined them, taking detailed notes. "This is extensive," Martinez said when he finished, "but we'll need more than just your word. Are there other officers who might corroborate any of this?" Thompson thought of Rodriguez and his unborn baby. "Maybe, but they're scared." "And you're not?" Martinez asked, studying his face. "I'm terrified," Thompson admitted, "but I keep thinking about something my father taught me about wearing the badge. It's not just about enforcing the law, it's about standing up for what's right." Martinez nodded slowly. "We'll need to move quickly, if what you're saying about Wilson is true." She was interrupted by a knock at the door. Another agent entered with an urgent expression. After a whispered conversation, Martinez's face darkened. There's been an incident at the jail, she said. Wilson was found unconscious in his cell 20 minutes ago. They're saying he tried to hang himself. Thompson stood up so quickly his chair fell backward. That's impossible. They're trying to. Sit down, Officer Thompson, Martinez commanded. We're moving now. I'm calling the FBI Civil Rights Division. This just became a federal case. The next few hours passed in a blur. Thompson watched as teams of agents descended on the jail. Martinez had him wait in a secure office while they conducted initial raids and interviews. Through the window, he could see police cars and federal vehicles filling the parking lot. Around noon, Martinez returned. Wilson's alive, she said, and Thompson felt his knees go weak with relief. He's at County General under protection. The suicide attempt was staged. Our medical examiner found evidence of a struggle and defensive wounds. Sullivan and Carson. In custody, along with Deputy Warden Phillips. We found the money trail. They've been running a corruption scheme for years. Wilson wasn't their first victim, just the first one who fought back effectively. Thompson sank into a chair. What happens now? Now? Martinez gave him a small smile. Now we start cleaning house. We've already had 3 other officers come forward after they saw our teams arrive. Sometimes people just need to see that change is possible. Later that afternoon, Thompson stood in the hospital corridor, looking through the window at Wilson's room. The older man was bruised but alert, talking with federal agents. When he spotted Thompson, he gave a slight nod of recognition. Thompson's phone buzzed. Another text from his father. Seeing the news about the jail. Call me when you can, son. I'm proud of you. Tears blurred Thompson's vision. The thin blue line he'd been so afraid to cross had turned out to be an illusion. Real loyalty wasn't about protecting corruption. It was about protecting justice, even when justice wore prison clothes instead of a uniform. Martinez appeared beside him. Ready to give your official statement? This is just the beginning. We're going to need good officers to help rebuild after this. Thompson straightened his shoulders. For the first time in weeks, his badge felt like it meant something again. Yes, he said. I'm ready. The media storm hit like a hurricane. By the next morning, news vans lined the streets around the jail, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Thompson watched from inside as reporters crowded the entrance, their cameras flashing every time someone walked through the doors. Agent Martinez had prepared him for this. The press is going to be all over this story, she warned. Corruption, racism, attempted murder. It's got everything they love. But stick to the facts. Let the evidence speak for itself. The headline on the morning news read, Mass corruption exposed at Central County Jail. Multiple officers arrested. Below it was a photo of Sullivan and Carson being led out in handcuffs, their faces twisted with rage. Deputy Warden Phillips was shown in another shot, his head bowed as federal agents escorted him to a waiting car. Inside the jail, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Officers who hadn't been arrested yet walked the halls like ghosts, avoiding eye contact with each other. Some had already resigned. Others were frantically cooperating with investigators, hoping to save themselves. Thompson sat in interview room B, helping federal agents go through years of records. His knowledge of the jail's daily operations proved invaluable as they uncovered more evidence of wrongdoing. Look at this, he said, pointing to a stack of medical request forms. All these denied requests have the same signature, Officer Carson's. But he wasn't even the medical liaison. He shouldn't have been handling these at all. Agent Roberts, a tall woman with graying hair, nodded as she added the forms to their evidence pile. We're finding similar patterns everywhere. They had quite a system going. Deny medical care, plant contraband, falsify reports, then use that leverage to extort money from inmates' families. The families paid to protect their loved ones, Thompson said quietly, remembering all the times he'd seen worried relatives at visitation. Around lunchtime, Rodriguez appeared at the door of the interview room. The young officer looked nervous but determined. I want to make a statement, he announced. About Wilson's transfer to solitary. About everything I've seen. He glanced at Thompson. You were right. We can't stay quiet anymore. As Rodriguez gave his statement, more officers began coming forward. It was like a dam breaking. Once a few spoke up, others found their courage too. By evening, the investigation had expanded to include dozens of new witnesses. Thompson was leaving the building when he saw Wilson being interviewed by a news crew. He'd been released from the hospital and was wearing a suit instead of prison clothes. Despite his bruises, he spoke with the same calm dignity Thompson remembered. "This isn't just about a few bad officers," Wilson was saying to the reporter. "This is about a system that allowed corruption to flourish. But it's also about hope. Hope that good people will eventually stand up and do what's right." Their eyes met across the parking lot, and Wilson paused his interview to walk over. "Officer Thompson," he said, extending his hand. "Or should I say, key witness Thompson." Thompson shook his hand, noticing how different it felt from their furtive conversations in the exercise yard. "I'm sorry it took me so long to act," he said. Wilson shook his head. "You acted when it mattered most. When they put me in that cell, I thought." He paused, collecting himself. "Well, let's just say your timing was perfect." A federal agent approached them. "Mr. Wilson, we've finished reviewing your original case files. The evidence of planted drugs is clear. We'll be filing for immediate dismissal of all charges." Thompson watched as Wilson absorbed this news. 3 years of his life had been stolen, but his face showed no bitterness, only determination. "The real work starts now," Wilson said, looking back at the jail. "This place needs more than just arrests. It needs complete reform." "Are you going back to your legal work?" Thompson asked. Wilson smiled. "Actually, I've been asked to join a federal task force on prison reform. They think my unique perspective might be valuable." As the sun set behind the jail's high walls, Thompson realized that this wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. The corruption had been exposed, but the harder task of rebuilding trust and creating real change still lay ahead. The courthouse was packed on a cold Monday morning as the first round of trials began. Thompson sat in the witness box, his testimony clear and unwavering as he described years of systematic abuse and corruption. Behind him, the gallery was filled with reporters, former inmates and their families, and officers, some there to support the investigation, others glaring with barely concealed hatred. "Officer Thompson," the prosecutor asked, "could you please explain to the jury what you witnessed on the night of March 15th? Thompson described finding Wilson's evidence, the suspicious meetings in the parking lot, and the staged suicide attempt. As he spoke, he could see Sullivan and Carson at the defense table, their faces hard with anger. Deputy Warden Phillips sat separately with his expensive lawyer, already trying to cut a deal. "They didn't just break the law," Thompson testified, looking directly at the jury. "They broke every principle that badge stands for. They turned a place of correction into a place of profit and persecution." During a break in the proceedings, Thompson found himself in the courthouse hallway next to Rodriguez, who had just finished his own testimony. "My baby was born yesterday," Rodriguez said quietly, showing Thompson a photo on his phone. "A little girl. When she's older, I want to tell her I did the right thing, even when it was hard." The trial lasted 3 weeks. One by one, witnesses came forward. Officers, inmates, family members, even administrative staff. The evidence was overwhelming. Wilson's careful documentation became the backbone of the prosecution's case, supported by financial records, surveillance footage, and dozens of testimonies. The defense tried to paint Thompson as a traitor, someone who betrayed his fellow officers out of personal grudges. But their arguments fell apart under the weight of evidence. When the medical examiner testified about Wilson's injuries in solitary, explaining how they couldn't possibly have been self-inflicted, even some of the defendant's supporters looked away in shame. On the day of the verdict, Thompson sat with Agent Martinez and Wilson. The jury had deliberated for only 4 hours, a sign, Martinez said, that the case was clear-cut. "Guilty on all counts," the foreman announced. Sullivan and Carson faced 20 years each for attempted murder, civil rights violations, and corruption. Phillips got 15 years. Several other officers received shorter sentences for their roles in the scheme. After the verdicts, Thompson stepped out of the courthouse into a crowd of reporters. Camera lights flashed as journalists shouted questions. "Officer Thompson, how does it feel to break the blue wall of silence? Will you continue working in law enforcement? Do you fear retaliation from other officers?" Before he could answer, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was his father, who had attended every day of the trial. "I'll handle this," the elder Thompson said to the reporters. My son did what every good officer should do. He protected the innocent and stood up against injustice. That's not breaking the blue wall. That's honoring what it should have been all along. Later that evening, Thompson sat in his father's backyard, both men nursing cold beers as they watched the sun set. The news played quietly from inside, showing footage of the defendants being led away to prison. You know, his father said, when I was on the force, we had a saying, the badge is a shield, not a sword. Somewhere along the way, some people forgot that. Thompson nodded, thinking of all the changes already happening at the jail. The new warden had implemented strict oversight measures. Body cameras were now mandatory. An independent review board had been established. Small steps, but important ones. His phone buzzed with a text from Wilson. Task force meeting tomorrow. We're reviewing applications for the new training program. Could use your input. Thompson smiled. After the trial, he'd been offered a position helping to train new officers, teaching them about ethics and accountability. It felt right, using his experience to shape the next generation of law enforcement. You know what the hardest part was? He said to his father. Not the testimony or the threats. It was taking that first step, speaking up that first time. His father nodded. Change always starts with one person willing to stand up. You did good, son. You did real good. Above them, stars began appearing in the darkening sky. The weight of the trial was lifting, replaced by something else. Hope for a better future in law enforcement, one built on justice and integrity rather than fear and silence. 1 year later, Thompson stood before a class of new recruits at the Law Enforcement Training Academy. The classroom was full of eager faces, men and women ready to begin their careers in corrections. On the wall behind him hung a framed newspaper article with the headline, Central County Jail, 1 year after the reforms. Your badge is a symbol of trust, Thompson began, touching the shield on his chest. But that trust has to be earned every single day, with every single decision you make. In the back of the room sat Marcus Wilson, now serving as a special advisor to the State Department of Corrections. He nodded encouragingly as Thompson continued his lecture. A year ago, this facility was a symbol of everything wrong with our system, Thompson said, pulling up slides showing the changes they'd made. Today, we're becoming a model for reform. But that change didn't happen by itself. It happened because people chose to do what was right instead of what was easy. After class, Wilson joined Thompson in the break room. Both men had aged during the past year, but there was a lightness to them now, a sense of purpose fulfilled. The new oversight committee approved all our recommendations, Wilson said, sliding a report across the table. Independent investigators, monthly reviews, mandatory bias training, even a new medical facility wing. Thompson smiled, remembering the dark days when such changes seemed impossible. How's the civil rights practice going? Busy, Wilson chuckled. But good busy. We've helped 3 other facilities start similar reform programs. The ripple effect is real. He paused, looking thoughtful. You know, when they first arrested me on those fake charges, I thought my life was over. Never imagined I'd end up helping to change the whole system. A group of recruits passed by the break room, respectfully nodding to both men. Thompson noticed how different these new officers were, more diverse, better educated about inmates' rights, trained to see their role as guardians rather than just guards. Rodriguez made sergeant, Thompson mentioned, his daughter's walking now. He brings her to the family days we started having at the jail. Wilson smiled. Speaking of family, how's your father doing with the new training program? Richard Thompson had come out of retirement to help develop the ethics curriculum, bringing 40 years of experience to the next generation. He loves it, Thompson said. Says it gives him hope for the future. Later that afternoon, Thompson walked through the jail corridors, doing his regular supervision rounds. The changes were everywhere. New medical response protocols, security cameras with automatic backup, even a grievance system that actually worked. He passed cell 237, Wilson's old cell. It now housed a young man who was enrolled in the jail's new GED program. The inmate was sitting at a proper desk, another new addition, studying from a textbook. In the staff room, photos on the wall showed community outreach events, training sessions, and ceremonies honoring officers who demonstrated exceptional ethics. There was even a plaque commemorating the Wilson-Thompson reforms, though both men had tried to decline that honor. Thompson's phone buzzed. A message from Martinez, now promoted to senior agent. State Commission wants you and Wilson to present the reform model next month. You free? As Thompson typed his reply, he heard the shift change bell ring. New officers came in while others left, all wearing body cameras that couldn't be turned off. Another change that had met resistance at first, but now was just part of the job. Outside in the parking lot, Thompson met up with Wilson, who was leaving after a day of training sessions. Ever regret it? Wilson asked suddenly. Standing up that day, your life would have been easier if you just looked the other way. Thompson watched the sun setting behind the jail walls, the same walls that had once housed so much darkness but now represented hope for real change. Not for a second, he replied. You know what I regret? Not doing it sooner. Wilson nodded, understanding. Well, we can't change the past, but the future? He gestured to the jail, where lights were coming on for the night shift. The future's looking brighter every day. As they walked to their cars, Thompson thought about all the lives touched by the changes they'd made. Inmates getting real rehabilitation, officers learning to serve with honor, families seeing justice done. The system wasn't perfect yet, but it was moving in the right direction. And it had all started with one choice, one moment of courage, one decision to stand up for what was right. Sometimes, Thompson realized, that's all it takes to change the world.